The wind carried dust across the open street of Willow Creek, a small Montana frontier town clinging to survival on the edge of endless plains. Stagecoach wheels creaked as they ground to a stop before the saloon and general store. Passengers disembarked, each drawing curious glances from locals loitering under wooden awnings. Among them stepped a young woman clutching a battered leather satchel, her face pale from exhaustion and days of travel. Elellanena Barnes paused at the edge of the boardwalk, boots scuffing against warped planks, and steadied herself with a breath. Her dress was simple, patched at the hem, the color faded from too many washings in cold rivers. It was all she had left. Yet she held her head high, for she had come here with purpose. Inside her satchel rested a bundle of letters, inked promises, from a man named Matthew Wilson, a rancher who had written of opportunity, partnership, and marriage. She had crossed nearly half the country by train and stage to stand here, ready to start a life with him. The thought steadied her, for she had little else. "Miss Barnes?" A sharp voice cut through the air. Her heart leapt, and she turned. Quickly. A man in a fine vest, hat tipped back, strode forward with narrowed eyes. His boots were polished, his mustache neatly trimmed. This was Matthew Wilson. Relief spread through her chest, yet it quickly faltered when she saw the disdain etched across his face. "You're her?" he asked, as though the word itself soured his tongue. Elellanena nodded, clutching her satchel tighter. "Yes, Mr. Wilson. I came just as we agreed." Matthew looked her over from head to toe, at her travel-worn dress, her calloused hands, the weary slump of her shoulders. A sneer tugged at his lips, and he let out a humorless laugh. "You didn't mention you were this poor," he said loudly, drawing the attention of men lounging by the saloon doors. "I thought I was writing to a woman fit to stand beside me, not—" He gestured dismissively. "This." A hot flush burned her cheeks. Murmurs rippled among the onlookers. She felt every pair of eyes upon her, the weight of their smirks and whispers. Her mouth opened, but words caught in her throat. "I came because you asked me to," she finally managed, her voice trembling. "I believed—" "You believed?" "Wrong," Matthew cut in, cruel satisfaction gleaming in his eyes. "A man like me has standards. You've nothing to offer, no dowry, no looks worth boasting of. I'd be a fool to chain myself to you." Gasps and chuckles rose from the crowd. Elellanenna's vision blurred, shame flooding her body like ice water. She wanted to vanish, to sink beneath the boards at her feet, yet she remained frozen, pinned in place by humiliation. Matthew turned, on his heel with a dismissive wave. "Find your own way, girl. I won't have you." His words cracked like a whip across her heart. He disappeared into the saloon, leaving her stranded in the middle of the street. Men laughed openly now, some shaking their heads, others spitting into the dust as though to punctuate her worthlessness. Women whispered behind gloved hands, their pity as cutting as mockery. Children stared with wide eyes, learning cruelty from their elders. Elellanena swallowed hard, blinking back tears. She could not let them fall, not here, not now. Slowly she straightened her spine, though her legs trembled beneath her. With no home to return to, no kin waiting, she had nowhere else to go. She was truly alone. Clutching her satchel, she stepped down off the boardwalk. The coach that had carried her this far was already rumbling away, leaving her stranded. Dust settled over her shoulders like a shroud. She wandered down the street, past buildings of raw timber and peeling paint. Every doorway seemed to close itself to her, every face turned away. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, but she had only a few coins, barely enough for bread, not for lodging. Her dream of marriage, of belonging, had shattered within minutes. By late afternoon, she found herself beyond the town's edge, walking along a dirt trail that stretched toward the horizon. Prairie grass swayed in the wind, whispering like voices she could not understand. She kept moving, for to stop would mean admitting defeat. But the words echoed in her mind. Nothing to offer. Nothing to offer. Each step felt heavier until her knees threatened to buckle. At last, her legs gave way. She sank to the ground beside a weathered fence post, clutching her satchel to her chest. Tears broke free, hot and bitter, slipping down her cheeks, despite her fight to hold them back. Alone in the wilderness, abandoned by the man who had promised her a future, she felt like nothing more than a discarded burden. The sun dipped lower, bleeding red across the plains. Somewhere in the distance, a lone rider approached, his silhouette cutting against the fading light. He rode with steady rhythm, not hurried, not hesitant. The leather creak of his saddle echoed faintly through the stillness. Elellanena lifted her head, her tear-streaked face catching the last rays of sun. For a moment, she thought the rider might pass her by, just another shadow crossing her path. But as he drew nearer, the horse slowed, and the man pulled rein. His gaze lingered on the figure of the woman collapsed by the fence. He said nothing at first, only watched quietly, his presence solid yet unassuming. Nathan Blackwood had lived long years in silence, preferring cattle and solitude to crowds and laughter. Yet something in this sight, a woman broken and abandoned, fighting to keep dignity, stirred him deeply. The choice weighed heavy in the air, though no words had been spoken. A choice that would alter both their lives forever. The last light of day painted the sky in muted strokes of orange and violet as Nathan Blackwood sat astride his horse, studying the stranger before him. She looked small against the vast emptiness of the plains, her shoulders shaking with exhaustion. He had seen lost travelers before, some beaten by storms, others driven by hunger. But rarely had he seen a woman alone at this hour, abandoned on the trail like unwanted baggage. Nathan swung down from his saddle with practiced ease. His boots crunched against gravel as he approached, his broad shadow falling across her. "You'll freeze out here once the sun's gone," he said quietly, his voice deep and even. Elellanena blinked up at him, startled. Her tears had smeared dust across her face, but her eyes held both defiance and fear. I have nowhere to go." Nathan studied her a moment longer, then glanced toward the empty horizon. "Then you'll come with me." The words held no flourish, no pity, just a plain fact spoken by a man used to action over talk. He extended a rough, calloused hand. For a heartbeat she hesitated, wary of placing her fate in another stranger's grasp. Yet the choice was simple: remain here and perish, or take hold of this chance. Slowly she placed her trembling hand into his. Nathan lifted her gently to her feet, then helped her onto his horse, settling her before him. He mounted behind, steady arms guiding the reins as they rode into the darkening expanse. The journey was silent but steady, the rhythmic beat of hooves, the smell of leather, and the faint creak of saddle straps filled the air between them. Elellenanena's thoughts tangled, shame from the public rejection, dread of what awaited, faint flickers of gratitude for this unexpected kindness. Nathan, for his part, asked no questions. He only rode with the certainty of a man who had made up his mind. At last, the faint glow of lamplight appeared ahead, a small cabin tucked against a line of cottonwoods, its smoke curling thin into the night sky. Nathan slowed his horse and brought them to the gate of a fenced homestead. "This is mine," he said simply, dismounting and helping her down. The cabin stood plain but sturdy, built of hewn logs weathered by years of harsh Montana winds. A barn squatted nearby, the smell of hay and animals thick in the air. Though it was far from grand, there was a sense of order, of quiet resilience woven into every board. Inside, warmth from a crackling fire greeted them. The single-room cabin bore the marks of a man's solitary life, shelves lined with tools, A table set with only one chair, a narrow bed pushed against the wall. Nathan stoked the fire higher, then motioned for her to sit. Rest. You'll eat. Elellanena sank into the chair, her body trembling as the warmth seeped back into her bones. She watched as he moved about the room with calm efficiency, setting a pot over the fire, slicing bread, pouring water into a tin cup. The silence stretched, but it was not unkind. When he set the food before her, she hesitated, ashamed of her hunger. But Nathan only nodded once, as if to say, "You need this." And so she ate slowly at first, then with ravenous gratitude. When she finished, she wiped her hands nervously on her skirt. I don't know how to thank you." Nathan regarded her with steady eyes. "Don't. Just live." His words carried no sentiment, but in their plainness, they offered something she had not felt in a long time: dignity. That night he gave her his bed, taking the floor by the fire. Though the storm winds rattled the shutters, she lay awake not from fear, but from a strange unfamiliarity. Safety. And morning broke with pale light seeping through the shutters. Nathan was already up, pulling on boots, his frame silhouetted against the fire. "You'll need clothes fit for work," he said without preamble. "I'll ride into town later. But first, chores. Chores." The word sparked both dread and relief. To work was to belong, and though she feared failure, she longed for purpose. She followed him outside, the crisp air biting at her cheeks. The ranch unfolded around her. Small herd of cattle lowing in the distance, chickens pecking near the barn, fences in need of mending. Nathan handed her a pail. "Water's down the path. Bring it back. Slow if you must." She nodded, gripping the pail with both hands. The handle cut into her palm, the weight nearly toppling her as she carried it from the well. When she returned, Nathan gave no criticism, no smirk. He simply nodded once again and set her to another task. By midday her arms ached, her skirt was dust-stained, and sweat slicked her brow. Yet beneath the fatigue stirred something fierce. The sense that she could still be of use, still build something with her hands. As she gathered eggs from the henhouse, a small, unexpected laugh slipped from her lips at the flapping protest of a chicken. Nathan, hammering at a fence post nearby, looked over. For the first time, she saw a faint curl of amusement at the corner of his mouth. The silence between them was beginning to shift, not empty, not sharp, but quietly shared. That evening, she sat by the fire once more, her muscles heavy, but her spirit steadier. Nathan ate beside her, saying little. Yet she realized that in this cabin she was not mocked, not dismissed. Here, she was simply human. And for Elellanena Barnes, that was the first mercy she had known in years. The weeks that followed were not easy. Life on Nathan Blackwood's ranch was a daily grind of labor, quiet endurance, and unexpected lessons. For Elellanena Barnes, every sunrise brought another chance to prove herself, though each day also reminded her how ill-prepared she was for such a life. She burned her hands on the iron stove while trying to cook beans. She spilled milk when she could not calm the cow. Her stitches tore crookedly when she attempted to mend torn shirts. More than once, she expected Nathan to rebuke her, to throw her failures in her face the way Matthew Wilson had done in the street, but Nathan never raised his voice. He corrected her with quiet steadiness, showing rather than mocking, and always returned to his work without lingering judgment. If anything, he carried her mistakes with the same patience he gave the cattle, as though error was simply part of being alive. Still, humiliation gnawed at her. One morning, as she fumbled with the pail at the well, she muttered bitterly, "You should have left me on the road. I'm nothing but a burden." Nathan, leaning against the fence rail, lifted his gaze. His voice came calm but firm. "A burden doesn't work until her hands bleed." She froze, the truth of his words cutting deeper than kindness. He turned, back to his task, as if the matter was closed. But his words lingered long after. It was late winter when the first real trial came. A biting wind swept down from the mountains, carrying snow that buried the plains in white silence. Nathan had ridden out early to check the herd, leaving Elellanena to keep the cabin warm and prepare food for his return. By mid-afternoon, the wind roared harder, rattling the cabin walls. She paced anxiously, tending the fire, staring at the door as though her worry might summon him. The storm thickened until she could barely see the line of trees beyond the barn. Then she heard it. The faint, uneven crunch of footsteps outside. The door opened with a violent gust, and Nathan stumbled, in half-dragging, half-carrying a yearling calf swaddled in burlap. Its sides heaved with shallow breaths, eyes wide with panic. "Lost him in the drift," Nathan muttered, voice rough from the cold. "We save him, or he dies tonight." Without hesitation, Elellanena threw extra wood into the fire and rushed to fetch blankets. Together they spread them before the hearth, laying the calf down as snow melted from its coat. Nathan rubbed the animal's chest, coaxing it to breathe steadier, while Elellanena dashed back and forth, warming cloths and laying them over its trembling body. Hours passed in tense silence, broken only by the crackle of fire and the calf's ragged breaths. Elellanena's hands trembled with exhaustion, yet she refused to stop, as though her very life depended on the creature's survival. At last, near midnight, the calf's breathing deepened. Its shivering slowed, its head settling against the floorboards with weary calm. Nathan exhaled heavily, shoulders sagging in relief. "You did well," he said quietly, glancing at her. Elellanena's chest tightened at the words. For so long, she had been told she was not enough, too poor, too plain, too much of a burden. Yet here, in this cabin, she had helped preserve life itself. When Nathan placed a hand briefly on her shoulder, the warmth of it reached deeper than fire. But the storm carried more than snow. Days later, when they finally rode into town for supplies, whispers met them before they even stepped into the store. Women leaned close, voices sharp as needles. "That's her, the poor one Wilson threw aside. Already living with Blackwood, I hear. Bold, isn't she?" Laughter pricked at her like thorns. Elellanena kept her chin high, but shame burned her throat. Matthew Wilson's rejection had not ended on that dusty street. It trailed her like a curse. As she paid for flour with coins Nathan had given her, she heard a familiar voice behind her. Well, if it isn't the charity case. Matthew Wilson stood there smirking, his fine vest neatly buttoned, his boots spotless. Around him, townsfolk fell quiet, eager for the show. Elellanena froze, hands tightening on the flour sack. "You look better in Blackwood's shadow than I thought you." "Would," Matthew sneered, "but don't fool yourself. You'll never be more than what I said you were. Nothing." The words struck like stones, reopening the wound she had tried to heal. For a moment she trembled on the edge of collapse. But then Nathan's voice cut through the silence. "Enough." The single word was low but heavy, carrying the weight of a man who rarely spoke but never bent. Nathan stepped forward, placing himself between her and Matthew. His steady gaze locked onto Wilson's smug smile until the other man faltered, the bravado in his posture wilting under the rancher's quiet strength. "She's with me," Nathan said simply, each word deliberate. "That's all anyone here needs to know." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Matthew scowled, but when he tried to retort, the room had already turned against him. The authority in Nathan's voice had cut deeper than insults ever could. For Elellanena, the moment was a revelation. Nathan hadn't made a speech, hadn't defended her worth with fancy words. He had done something far greater. He had stood. That night, back at the ranch, she sat by the fire with tears burning her eyes. Not of shame, but of something closer, to vindication. Nathan said little, as always, but when he set a cup of warm broth before her, Their hands brushed briefly, and she realized that in this cabin, she was not the poor girl mocked in town. She was Elellanena Barnes, capable, needed, and seen. Spring thaw came slow to Montana. Snow melted into mud, and swollen streams cut across the prairie like scars. Nathan's ranch weathered it with quiet resilience, his cattle grazing on what little grass had returned. For Elellanena, the season meant harder chores, more hours, and an unrelenting test of her spirit. Yet within the exhaustion, she felt something new: belonging. Each blister, each ache, each small success was proof she had earned her place here. But peace on the frontier was fragile. One evening, as dusk bled into night, Nathan and Elellanena sat by the fire, sharing a rare silence that felt less like absence and more like company. The knock on the door shattered it. Nathan rose immediately, hand brushing against the rifle propped by the hearth. When he opened the door, 3 figures stood on the porch. They smelled of whiskey even before the wind carried it inside. "Well now," one slurred, grinning through crooked teeth. "Blackwood, didn't think you had it in you, to bring home Wilson's cast-off." Elellanena stiffened where she sat, blood turning cold. Matthew's cronies. She recognized them from the jeering crowd that day in town. "Leave," Nathan said flatly. The tallest man, a brute with a scar down his cheek, stepped forward. "We're just here to say, Wilson ain't happy. Says you're keeping what don't belong to you. He aims to collect." Nathan's gaze sharpened. "She's not his. Not anyone's but her own." Laughter erupted from the porch. "Hear that? Blackwood's playing hero. You think you can keep her safe out here with no one but you and a few head of cattle?" The men shifted, shoulders squaring, hands twitching toward the pistols at their hips. Tension filled the air, thick and unyielding. Nathan didn't move. His calm was unnerving, as if he had been carved from the very timber of his cabin. "This is your last chance. Leave." The leader's smile faltered. The steel in Nathan's voice was not bluster. It was the quiet certainty of a man who would not hesitate. After a tense pause, the men spat curses into the dirt and turned away, stumbling back toward the shadows. But as they disappeared into the dark, one called over his shoulder, "This ain't over, Blackwood. Wilson always gets what he wants." Nathan shut the door, bolting it with deliberate calm. The firelight flickered across his face, jaw tight, eyes hard. Elellanenna's hands trembled against her lap. "They'll come back," she whispered. Nathan set the rifle on the table, his voice steady. "Then we'll be ready." The threat loomed in the days that followed. Nathan reinforced the barn doors, sharpened tools into weapons, and kept his rifle closer than ever. Elellanena did her part, though fear coiled in her chest each time the wind rattled the shutters. It was during one such night that the test came. A storm swept across the plains, thunder shaking the very ground. Rain battered the roof in sheets, and the wind howled through the gaps in the shutters. Nathan paced near the fire, ears sharp to every sound beyond the storm's roar. Then came the crack of wood splintering, the barn doors. Nathan grabbed his rifle and strode into the night, rain soaking him instantly. Elellanena, heart pounding, snatched a lantern and followed, refusing to be left behind. Lightning split the sky, illuminating chaos. The 3 men had returned, their shapes moving against the barn. One held a torch, its flame sputtering in the downpour, threatening to catch on the dry hay inside. "Stop!" Nathan's voice cut through the storm. The men turned, grinning wickedly. The torchbearer laughed. "What'll you do, Blackwood? You can't guard her forever." The torch swung toward the barn. Without hesitation, Nathan fired. The shot rang out, the torch dropping into the mud as the man screamed, clutching his shoulder. The others drew weapons, but Nathan's second shot struck the ground at their feet, sending mud flying. "Try me," Nathan growled. The storm raged around them, but it was Nathan's presence that dominated the night. The men faltered, their courage unraveling beneath his unshakable stance. Muttering curses, they dragged their wounded comrade away, vanishing into the storm. Elellanena stood frozen, rain plastering her hair to her face, lantern light trembling in her hand. Nathan turned toward her, chest heaving, eyes softening now that the danger had passed. "You shouldn't have come out," he said, voice rough, but she shook her head fiercely. "I won't hide while others fight for me." Not anymore. For a moment neither spoke. The storm raged, but between them a deeper truth settled. This was no longer mere shelter, no longer mere obligation. Their lives were now bound by shared danger, by the fire they had both stood against. Back inside, dripping and weary, Nathan set his rifle aside. Elellanena tended the lantern, her hands still trembling. He watched her in silence, the quiet, stretching not from distance, but from something unspoken growing between them. Finally, he said, "They'll come again. But they won't take you." Elellanena met his gaze, and for the first time since her arrival, she believed it. She was no longer the humiliated girl abandoned in town. She was a woman standing in the heart of a storm, and beside her stood a man who would fight for her, as fiercely as she now vowed to fight for herself. The storm had passed, but its memory lingered like smoke in the rafters. For days afterward, Elellanena found herself listening for footsteps in the night, every gust of wind carrying the echo of Matthew Wilson's threats. Yet life on the ranch pressed forward, as relentless as the prairie itself. Chores waited, animals needed tending, and fences demanded repair. And it was in that rhythm of labor that something began to change. One crisp morning, Nathan led Elellanena into the barn, where a calf had been born in the night. The tiny creature wobbled on unsteady legs, its mother lowing softly nearby. Elellanenna's eyes widened with wonder as she knelt, her hands brushing the calf's damp fur. "Life comes hard out here," Nathan said, leaning on the stall rail. "But it comes, and when it does, you hold on to it." She looked up at him, the calf pressing against her hand. "That's what you did for me, isn't it?" Nathan said nothing, but the faintest shift in his expression, something caught between acknowledgement and quiet humility, was answer enough. It was not only Nathan who began to accept her, but the land and its small, stubborn community. Entour. Sundays, when they rode into town for supplies or service at the small clapboard church, whispers still followed them. But the tone had shifted. Children tugged at their mothers' skirts, pointing curiously at the woman who worked beside Nathan, Blackwood as though she had always been there. Men at the store nodded politely now, wary of Nathan's steady presence. And though some women still muttered, others offered small kindnesses. A loaf of bread, a word of encouragement, even a smile. One afternoon, a neighbor rode up to the ranch with his 2 children in tow. Nathan had agreed to help mend a wagon axle, and while he worked, the children wandered toward the barn where Elellanena was scattering feed for the chickens. The younger girl, no more than 6, watched her with solemn eyes before blurting, "Are you really his wife?" Elellanena froze, the feed spilling through her fingers. Heat rose to her cheeks. "No," she said softly, uncertain how else to answer. The girl frowned thoughtfully. "You seem like a wife. You do the things mamas do." The words struck Elellanena harder than she expected. She turned away quickly, blinking back tears, but when she glanced toward the barn door, Nathan stood there having overheard. His gaze held hers for a long, steady moment, unreadable, yet filled with something she dared not name. The turning point came weeks later. Nathan had taken ill after a long day riding fence in the rain. Fever gripped him, leaving him pale and restless, his strength drained. For the first time since she had met him, Elellanena saw him vulnerable. She tended him through the night, pressing cool cloths to his forehead, coaxing him to drink broth. Each time he stirred, she whispered steady reassurances, her hands firm despite her trembling heart. At dawn, his fever broke. Nathan stirred, eyes opening weakly to find her still by his side. "You should rest," he murmured. "So should you," she replied, her voice thick with exhaustion. For the first time, his lips curved into something more than the faint curl she had glimpsed before. It was a true smile, small, fleeting, but real. "Stubborn," he whispered. Elellanena laughed softly, the sound breaking like sunlight through clouds. In that moment she realized she had crossed a threshold. She was no longer a guest in his home, nor a burden tolerated. She was his partner in hardship, his anchor in weakness, his equal in quiet resilience. Not long after, as they sat by the fire sharing a rare moment of peace, Nathan's hand brushed hers on the table. He did not withdraw, neither did she. Their fingers intertwined naturally, without fanfare, as if it had always been meant. That night, when she rose to tend the fire, he spoke into the quiet. "You belong here." Her breath caught, the words striking deeper than any vow. "I do," she whispered. He met her gaze steadily. "Yes." The silence that followed was not empty, but full, of acceptance, of unspoken promises, of something fragile but fierce taking root. By early summer, the shift had reached the children in town. On one visit to the general store, the same little girl who had once asked if she was Nathan's wife tugged on Elellenanena's sleeve. "Mama," she said innocently, before her own mother hurried her away with a flustered apology. Elellanena stood frozen, her heart pounding. The word lingered in the air, both terrifying and wondrous. She turned to Nathan, who carried the sack of flour with his usual calm. He gave no outward reaction, yet when their eyes met, something unspoken passed between them. A recognition that what had begun as obligation was becoming chosen, deliberate love. For the first time since stepping off the stagecoach, Elellanena no longer felt like a rejected bride. She felt like a woman standing at the threshold of a new life, one that was hers to claim. And Nathan Blackwood, the lonely rancher who had once chosen silence over the world, was now choosing her. Summer on the Montana plains could be crueler than winter. Where blizzards once choked the land with ice, now the sun beat it dry until the ground cracked, brittle as old parchment. The river near Nathan's ranch shrank into a muddy trickle. Cattle bellowed with thirst, and every day the horizon shimmered with heat that promised nothing but more suffering. Elellanena carried buckets until her arms ached, drawing what little water remained from the well. She rationed each drop carefully, some for the cattle, some for the garden, a meager portion for herself and Nathan. Yet the well sank lower each day, the rope groaning as it descended deeper into the earth. One blistering afternoon, she stumbled. Back from the garden, face pale with exhaustion. Nathan caught her arm, steadying her. His voice was calm but edged with concern. "You can't push yourself past breaking." She wiped her brow, shaking her head. "If I quit, the garden dies. And if the garden dies, we die." Nathan studied her, his gaze heavy with both worry and admiration. She was no longer the fragile figure he had found on the roadside. She was iron-forged by hardship, willing to carry more than her share. He did not argue. Instead, he carried the next buckets himself, side by side with her under the punishing sun. Despite their efforts, the drought tightened its grip. The cattle grew gaunt, ribs showing through hide, grass withered, and dust clung to every breath. At night, Nathan sat by the fire with maps and figures, calculating losses, weighing impossible choices. Elellanena watched him, her heart aching. She knew the burden he carried, the fear of losing everything he had built with his hands. Quietly, she set her needle to work, patching torn sacks, mending clothes, making do with scraps. It was all she could offer, to hold the edges of their life together while he bore the weight of its foundation. One evening, as thunder rolled distantly without rain, she placed a hand over his on the table. "You're not alone in this," she whispered. Nathan's eyes lifted, dark with exhaustion. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he turned his hand, clasping hers tightly. His grip was firm, steady, unyielding. A silent vow. The drought worsened. One morning, the garden lay shriveled, its leaves curled to dust. Elellanena dropped to her knees in the dirt, tears spilling despite her will. Months of labor, of hope, had dried into nothing. Nathan found her there, shoulders shaking, soil staining her hands. He knelt beside her, silent. Then he reached out, covering her hands with his. "Don't measure life by what we lose," he said quietly. "Measure it by what we keep." She looked at him through tears, seeing the lines of weariness etched deeper in his face, but also the unwavering steadiness in his eyes. It struck her then. This was not a man who sought easy days or soft living. He was a man who endured. And in his endurance, he had chosen her. Elellanena drew a trembling breath and nodded. Slowly, she rose to her feet. Together, they set their shoulders against the work of survival. Days blurred into weeks. They hauled water, salvaged what cattle they could, traded in town for seed with promises of repayment. Through it all, Elellanena refused to quit. Where others in her past had called her too poor or nothing, she now stood as the backbone of their small homestead, her resolve unbreakable. One night, when the worst of the heat had passed, Nathan sat with her beneath the cottonwoods. The stars spread wide overhead, endless and ancient. "You've given me more than I ever thought I'd have again," he said, his voice low. Elellanena turned toward him, heart hammering. "And you gave me a life when I had none." The silence stretched, charged with all the words they had not spoken. Then Nathan reached for her hand. This time, she did not hesitate. Fingers entwined, he leaned closer, and in the quiet night air, their lips met. It was not the desperate kiss of two souls clinging to each other, but the steady, reverent joining of two who had weathered storms and droughts and still stood side by side. When they parted, Nathan rested his forehead against hers. "We'll endure," he whispered. "Yes," she breathed. Together. From that night forward, something had shifted. Their bond was no longer unspoken, no longer tentative. It was a vow made not in words but in survival, in scars, in the quiet strength of two hearts that had chosen each other despite the world's cruelty. As the drought stretched on, they faced it not as strangers bound by circumstance, but as partners, bound by chosen love. And in that love, Elellanena discovered the truth Matthew Wilson had tried to bury. She was not too poor, nor too plain, nor too weak. She was more than enough. Years passed on the Blackwood ranch. Seasons rose and fell, storms came and went, but the cabin in the cottonwoods endured. What had once been Nathan's solitary dwelling grew into a true home, expanded with new rooms, filled with laughter, and the smells of bread baking, warmed by the hum of voices that had never existed there before. Elellanenna's hands, once trembling and uncertain, became sure with work. She planted gardens that flourished after the drought, raised livestock with steady resolve, and carried children on her hip as though it were the role she had been born to fill. Where once she had been mocked in the town square, now mothers sought her advice, children ran to her for comfort, and neighbors nodded to her as one of their own. For Nathan, the years softened the lines of solitude etched into his face. His hair grayed, his gait slowed, but his quiet strength never wavered. The man who had once chosen silence over the world now chose to speak. Few words still, but words of affirmation, words of love, words his children and wife carried in their hearts like blessings. There were hardships, as there always were on the frontier. Winters that bit hard, summers that scorched, sickness that threatened to take what they had built. But each test only deepened the bond between Nathan and Elellanena. They endured not as two souls surviving under the same roof, but as one, each carrying what the other could not. each giving where the other faltered. And in the quiet moments, after the children had fallen asleep, after the chores were done, after the fire crackled low, Nathan would take her hand, worn and calloused, and hold it as though it were the most precious thing he owned. "You gave me a family," he would whisper. And, "You gave me a home," she would reply. The words became their vow, spoken again and again across the years, until they were as much a part of the ranch as the walls that sheltered them. Time moved on. Children grew tall, married, and started families of their own. Grandchildren filled the ranch with shouts and laughter, chasing chickens through the yard, climbing the fences Nathan once mended with his own hands. The cabin expanded further, its roof patched and its walls repaired, but always anchored in the same earth where Nathan and Elellanena had first chosen each other. On summer evenings, Elellanena would sit in the garden she had once wept over, now thriving with rows of vegetables and wildflowers. She would watch the children play, Nathan beside her in his chair, and marvel at the life that had grown from the ashes of her rejection. Once when she held her youngest grandchild, a neighbor remarked, "Hard to believe you came here with nothing." Elellanena smiled softly, her gaze resting on Nathan. "I didn't come with nothing," she said. "I came with hope, and he gave me everything." Nathan's hand closed around hers, and in that small gesture, every year of hardship and love was summed up. When Nathan passed, it was in the quiet of dawn, with Elellanena''s hand in his. He left the world as he had lived in it, steady, dignified, unafraid. At his funeral, the small town gathered, no longer whispering, no longer mocking. They came to honor a man and woman who had built something greater than wealth, a legacy of resilience and love. Elellanena stood by his grave marker, the cottonwoods rustling overhead. Her children flanked her, her grandchildren tugged at her skirt, and still she felt the emptiness of his absence. Yet when she placed her palm against the rough stone, she whispered words that steadied her. "He gave me everything." Years later, when her own time came, they laid her beside him, beneath the same trees where he had first brought her home. The ranch continued, passed down through children and grandchildren, each generation repeating the story of the poor bride who was once rejected but became the heart of a family. And so the legacy endured. The cabin, weathered but strong. The garden, blooming each spring. The children and their children, carrying the name forward. And at the center, the memory of Nathan and Elellanena, the lonely rancher and the rejected bride who had built a life together out of ashes and made it into a world. Their story was no longer one of shame, nor rejection, nor poverty. It was a story of choice, of love, of redemption. And long after they were gone, when the prairie winds whispered through the cottonwoods, it was said you could still hear her words, soft and reverent, carried across the land. "He gave me everything." Though Elellanena Barnes arrived in Montana humiliated and rejected, she found something greater than what she lost. In Nathan Blackwood, the lonely rancher who chose action over words, she discovered dignity, love, and a home that would endure through generations. What began as shame became a legacy, proof that true worth is not measured by wealth or appearances, but by resilience, kindness, and the courage to choose love even in the harshest frontier. Stories like Elellanena''s remind us that even when the world calls us nothing, we can still rise and become everything to someone who sees our true value. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who believes in second chances. Leave a comment. We read every word. Subscribe. For more true Wild West tales of love and redemption. Because in the end, love is the greatest legacy.